Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's best books. I'm your host, Erik Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 52 books per year and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each book. Well, today's a special episode, and right next to me here on my desk, I have all 52 books for my 2022 reading list. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up each one and in the order that I read them and then share the one thing that comes to mind. So I don't have any notes prepared for these books. I've not thought about what I want to say for each of them, but I'm just going to say the first thing that comes to my mind. And I will also share how long it took me to read each book. I know that's a very nerdy thing to do, but I like to track it, one, just to see how long particular books take. And then I also like to track it so that I can share that and so that you know, oh, if I was interested in reading this book, this is about how long it would take. Please know that I'm not a fast reader at all. And so, and I'm taking notes and doing all sorts of stuff so that when I share the times for these books, it's quite generous. So you'll probably be able to finish it faster than what the time it took me to read it. But I do like to share that just so you have an idea of what a book may take for you to read. So I'll share that as well. But I share the one thing that comes to my mind. And if you've listened to any other episodes of this podcast, you know that at the end of each episode, I share the one thing, my one key takeaway from the book. And so part of this is I'm curious, how often will the one thing from when I did the episode, how often will that be the same one thing that I remember at the end of the year here? So this is a fun one for me. I love this episode. I love testing myself. It is embarrassing though too, because there'll probably be a few books here where I don't remember anything, and I'll just share that if I don't remember anything. But this can also be a good episode for you to learn about some of these books, and then it might spark an interest in be one that you want to add to one of your reading lists. So I'm going to geek out here. I'm going to go into the stats for the year. I'm going to, and then after that, I'll divide this episode into 4 other segments. And so this is segment 1. The next 3 segments 2, 3, and 4, I'll divide up the reading list into the first 17 books, then the next 17, and then the final 18. And again, I'll just pick them up in order and share the thing that I remember. And then in segment 5, I'm going to go kind of more broad view and share some of the following. So the first thing is just my top 5 books for the year. After that, books that I had on my original list that I removed. And then after that, books that I replaced those that I removed. I want to also talk about just a few overarching insights or ideas that struck me this year. The things just, when I kind of look back over the 52 books, what are some big level ideas or just things that I thought about, or maybe even not even things related to something I saw in the book, but just something that I grabbed elsewhere that applies to the books that I read. And then after that, I'll just do a quick recap of the first 6 years of this project, and then what I have planned for the next 10 plus years of this reading project. So real quick, here are the stats for the year. I read 52 books. There were 17,110 pages in those books. The time it took me to read all 52 of those books was 447 hours, 46 minutes, and 1 second. And I know that is super geeky. I use this app where every time I sit down to read, I just push start. I'm starting to read, and then when I finish end, and then I put it knows the page I started at, so then I just put in the page that I end. And so that 447 hours and 46 minutes is pretty accurate, because I track that pretty well. It took me 357 days to get through all those, and so that was from January 1st through December 23rd. That averaged 48 pages per day or for the list. I needed to average 47 per day to get through the entire reading list. And so what I do at the beginning of the year is I make a list of all the books that I'm going to read, and then I divide that by 365 days. So I know I need to read 47 pages per day. Being at 48 pages per day, I ended up finishing about a week early. The longest book on this year in terms of how long it took me to read was the Apocrypha. That took me 17 hours and 32 minutes to read. And then the shortest book on the list was a very short one by Ken Follett about Notre Dame, the cathedral in Paris. And that one took under an hour. That was just 40 minutes. So I have a wide variety of books here. Some are very long, some are very, very short, but those were the longest and the shortest. So next up in segment 2, I will start with the first 17 books on the list. All right, book 1 for 2022 was On Reading Well by Karen Swallow Prior, Finding the Good Life Through the Great Books. This one took me 7 hours and 44 minutes to read. And the one thing I remember from this one is the distinction of the virtues. So this is a book about virtues and how they show up in different works of literature. So Karen Swallow Prior will talk about different works, like The Great Gatsby was one of them. And she'll tie a virtue to it. And one thing I really liked is she defined virtue as something along a spectrum. And so it was a balance of something on one side and something on the other. So for instance, courage is the virtue, but if you're too courageous, you could become reckless, and if you're not courageous enough, you are a coward. And so courage is the balance of being too reckless, but also you don't want to go the other side and be a coward. So what the one thing from this book was just that distinction between the virtues. And she talks about the cardinal virtues, but then she talks about these theological virtues. And the theological virtues she called faith, hope, and love, and said that those needed to come from outside of you, needed to come from outside of me and work their way through me, as opposed to the cardinal virtues are ones that I could work on in that sort of thing. And what was just neat is I had that exact question going into this book. I had no idea it was going to answer this question, but in 2021, I just, from different books I was reading and just things I was thinking about, it was that question, like, okay, these virtues, like, what do I need God's help with in these virtues? And then which are the virtues that I can just kind of do on my own type thing. And so this book answered that question. And then I just loved how it did it through using literature. So it kind of introduced you to some books or just reminded you of ones that you've read. So I loved this book. I highly recommend it. And this book is going to come up a little later in this episode. I've got a neat little story on it as well. Book 2 for the year was The Black Count by Tom Rice, the subtitle of Glory, Revolution, Betrayal, and the Real Count of Monte Cristo. So one of my favorite books ever is The Count of Monte Cristo, and the author of that is Alexandre Dumas, and his father was just a stud. And I didn't know anything about his father, but this book is about his father. And his father grew up as a slave, ended up becoming an officer in Napoleon's army. Just a stud of a man. And this was his story. I think the one thing that stuck out to me the most in this is just the horrible situation in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and just the awful situation there. I mean, it was amazing to read about this man's life, and then just kind of see how it tied, and then his son's writing these amazing novels like The Three Musketeers, The Man in the Iron Mask, Count of Monte Cristo, and you see a lot of you can see the influences of his father in those stories. So that was book 2. Book 3, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and this is a work of nonfiction, but it's written like fiction, and Capote's actually gotten kind of in trouble, perhaps for being maybe too fictionalized, or he made up stuff or didn't get the story right. But it's a story about these two men who commit a horrendous series of murders of a family. So they rob a house and end up killing the people in cold blood. And the thing I remember is just the way it was written was such that I got scared, like being in my own house. Started locking the doors earlier at night, that kind of thing. He wrote in such a way that it was gripping, and this is one of those books that just will not leave you quickly. It took me 10 hours and a minute to read that one. Number 4 is The David Story by Robert Alter. This was a late addition to the reading list, and the reason is there's this group called the Catherine Project, and they will do online meetings. So you do them via Zoom, but you talk about a work of literature, and they even have some about operas and movies and different things like that. But you should check it out if you haven't, the Catherine Project. And so they'll release and say, we're having a reading group about the Iliad, and then they'll take maybe 10 to 15 people, and then you will discuss that over a period of a few months. And so I signed up for one on 1st and 2nd Samuel of the Hebrew Bible, and one of the books they suggested that we read for that was this David Story by Robert Alter. And what this is it's actually a translation and a commentary of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I loved it. This is my first introduction to Robert Alter. Someone had suggested I get his series where he did translate the entire Hebrew Bible. So I ended up getting that as well. But for this David Story, it was just fascinating. And so he translated the Hebrew Bible, but then he also wrote a commentary on it. And so what's great is he's saying why he chose certain words, English words. And you say, this is the Hebrew word, and this is where it also shows up. This is why I chose this word over this word. But it just helps you understand some of what's going on in the stories. And the thing that stuck out the most in this was in the story where Absalom is sleeping with his father's concubines. He's sleeping with them on the roof. And Robert Alter points out that roof was probably the exact roof where David first laid eyes upon Bathsheba. So King David was supposed to be at war. He's on his balcony, he's on his roof, and he sees Bathsheba bathing. And gosh, that just adds a whole other element to that story. The sins of the father being passed on to the kids. And so the very place where David first looked and saw and lusted after Bathsheba is the same exact place that his son later humiliates his father in front of everybody. Everybody can see up on this place where Absalom is doing that. Just so tragic to consider that and think about that, but just one of the many things and insights in reading this book. So I'd highly recommend it. It took me 16 hours and 56 minutes to read through that. And then I participated in this reading group for 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I loved it. I learned so much, and it really changed how I read the story of King David and Saul and Samuel. So very good introduction if you'd like one. Number 5, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, the subtitle of Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. This one took me 5 hours and 20 minutes to read through. And what was good is that this was written a while ago, so before internet, and it's kind of talking about how TV is ruining us, and you're just thinking, gosh, how much more so. Like all the things he's talking about, it's just gotten progressively deeper and worse. And so it's an eye-opening book, and then just one that really makes you rethink how you're using your time. And so the one thing that sticks out here is just talks about 2 different dystopian futures in ways that we talk about them. And most of the time we'll point to 2 well-known books, and one is 1984 by Orwell, and the other one is Brave New World by Huxley. And what he says is in 1984, it's kind of a top-down clampdown of totalitarianism. But in Brave New World, it's kind of a ground up where people are just amusing themselves to death. And so if you look around, just at least in the United States, what do you see most often? Do you see just kind of people getting numb from entertainment and just constant TV, constant internet, constantly looking at their phone, or is it a totalitarianism kind of coming down? And you obviously see both of those examples in the world today. But which one is more happening to us? And he would obviously say that that the Huxley book is more what is happening to us. So that's amusing ourselves to death. Number 5. So number 6 is The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State by Friedrich Engels. And this one was suggested by a friend, and he told me, this one is kind of the playbook for ushering communism in. And so the Communist Manifesto by Marx, I've not read that, but perhaps that would be more on the economic side, and then this one would be more on the cultural side. And so I read it going into it. Just I wanted to read it and see if I was hearing similar things being discussed in our modern time that was found in this book. And my one takeaway from this is actually embarrassing, and it's this: that I went in to reading this book with such an agenda and such a mindset that it completely impacted how I read the book. And so I read the book a particular way. I then recorded a podcast and released that podcast. And I got a few comments from people, and they were saying, you missed the point of the book and you did not read it correctly. And I invite that kind of feedback, and I welcome it, because I want to know what I'm missing. I want to be able to read better and better understand. And so they were saying, or one of my points in the podcast was that Engels, in the midway through the book, was calling for a revolution for these things to happen. He describes, what families would have looked like in the past, and if we keep going this certain way, this is what they'll look like. And then I said he called for a revolution for these things to be implemented. And the people who were commenting were saying he doesn't do that at all. And so I looked back at the book, in the very places that I thought he was doing that, he really didn't. He wasn't calling for revolution. It was more of, if society is moving in this direction, if it's moving more towards communism, this is what will happen to the family. And so it was almost more of a prophecy or a prediction of what was going to happen, as opposed to, hey, let's pick up guns and usher this thing in. And so I completely blew it, and I completely read into something that wasn't there. And so I have some embarrassing podcast episodes for this reading project where I just didn't read the book well, or said things that I kind of cringe at now, but I've left those up. I actually took that episode down that covered this book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, because I said things about it that were completely wrong, and it was really because I went in with a particular mindset and way that I thought it was going to be presented, that I missed what it actually said. And so I'm happy that happened, in the sense that it was a good lesson for me. It's an embarrassing lesson. I took that episode down, but I'm glad it happened, because I think I will be a better reader going in. And I need to be aware, if I'm going into a book with a particular idea of what it's going to say, I need to be even extra careful on that, because I'm very prone to reading it incorrectly. And so, yeah, that's my one thing with this book is that it took me 9 hours and 7 minutes to read The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Next up, number 7, The Long Ships by Franz Bengston. Sorry. This is a novel, but it's a novel that takes place in the Vikings times. And so I think it's like 800 Common Era AD to and then on. And so what was neat is it's taking actual people's names, and so you're coming across actual people who lived, but it's a story made up within that world. And what was neat is just the learning about where all the places that the Vikings had gone. So from Sweden, from Norway, just all the different places they had gone in the world and as conquerors and all that. And then I would say the one thing that stuck out the most is just the process of Christianity coming to that land and the changes and yeah, just, yeah, that's kind of the thing that comes to my mind when I think of this story. But then also just all the different lands they were in as part of that history. That one took me 16 hours and 29 minutes to read. Next up was The Bookseller of Florence. This was by Ross King, and the subtitle is The Story of the Manuscripts That Illuminated the Renaissance. I've read a couple other Ross King books. I went to Italy in 2004, and in preparation, I read a few books that King had done. Where he one of them was Brunelleschi's Dome, and so he wrote about the cathedral in Florence and the dome that's on the top of it, and just all the engineering feat that it was, and all that. And so I knew Ross King from reading those books and respected him. And so when I saw this one come out, I was like, man, this is right up my alley. This one will be fun. And the thing I remember most about this is it's nonfiction, and it takes place before the Renaissance. And there was a street in Florence that had a number of bookshops. And these bookshops, this is the time where there was not a printing press yet. And so these bookshops, they were sending people all over the world to these different monasteries to the Byzantine Empire, like all around to get these manuscripts and to copy them. So they're copying these by hand. There's illustrations in them. Vellum, just the whole works, but very expensive. So not a whole lot of people are reading books at this time. The books are probably being read to people, but just in terms of who has the money to buy them, it's a select few. Midway through this book, though, the Gutenberg press comes out, and now all of a sudden you've got books being pressed, and now a wider audience can read these books. And so this is happening right in the middle, and just a lot of other history that goes along with it. But the thing that stuck out the most is just this is pre-Renaissance, but these stories and the works that they're collecting from Plato and the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, this had a direct impact on the Renaissance starting in Italy, and a big part of it being in Florence. It kind of started here, like these booksellers bringing these works and people reading these works, and it just leading to these new ideas and things like that. And a lot of it started in these bookshops. So really cool. I loved reading about it. You learn a lot about just the history of the book, like why was it put together? Why is it a rectangle? Why is it this way? And so if you're a book lover, this is a really fun one. And that one took me 12 hours and 12 minutes to read. Next up was Rembrandt is in the Wind by Russ Ramsey. Russ Ramsey is the pastor of the church I go to here in Franklin, Tennessee. And this book is one about art. Russ loves art. He loves learning about art and then sharing what he's learning. And so every Wednesday he does Twitter Art Wednesdays, and he'll just share about different works of art. And this one was neat is in that he goes through different works of art and then shares about the artist. He shares about their work and then how they did their work. And so, just the tools to create the work, and then their faith as well. So did their faith play any part in the work that they did? And what's neat is you'll recognize a lot of the works that are talked about in this book. And the cover of the book is a Rembrandt painting that was actually stolen from a museum in Boston. But there's a chapter about Vermeer, and I don't want to give it away what happens, but the way and the method in which Vermeer paints, what just blew me away. I didn't know that that's how he did it, and it was just so interesting that I'm amazed, and that's the thing that always comes to mind when I think of this book. So Rembrandt is in the Wind by Russ Ramsey, 5 hours and 28 minutes to read that one. All right, next up, I did something a little different here, and I read. Well, I took a deep dive into an opera, and the opera is The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. I'm a big nerd, and in 2006, I had some air miles, and I was single at the time, and I flew to Vienna just to go see an opera. And so I saw The Marriage of Figaro in the city where it was first performed at the Opera House. It was amazing, but I loved this opera so much that I wanted to do that. But in all that time, I probably listened to it 500 times or more, the whole opera, and I have no idea what they're saying. And so I wanted to fix that. And so that's why I had this book on my list this year. And so what I did is I started with the book. So this is actually a play, by Beaumarchais. And so it's called the Figaro trilogy. So I read the whole trilogy. The first one is The Barber of Seville, which is another opera as well. And then you've got The Marriage of Figaro, and then after that there's one called The Guilty Mother. So it's the full story of Figaro, and so I got to read it for the first time. So I started with that. Started with the actual story that The Marriage of Figaro was based on by Beaumarchais. Next, I read the libretto, which are the words that are said during the opera. So I read the whole one for the Marriage of Figaro. And then I have a score, a musical score of the opera. I went through the opera. I listened to it while looking at the score. And then just went through the whole opera that way. So again, started with the story, then went through the libretto, then went through the musical score. And it was so fun, and I'm so glad I did that. And it just opened up the whole thing. And it just causes you to ask, why did Mozart do the music this way? Or are there connections between this song and that song? Are they in the same key? What key are they in? Do you hear a similar note or series? Do you hear a similar theme in here and there? Why is the intro to this entire opera? Why is it different from everything else in the opera? What's that trying to say? And so I think that's my one thing from this. I still haven't covered this one on the podcast. I may do that in the beginning of 2023 here, where I want to go through the different songs and just kind of share what's going on, what's being said, and that sort of thing. But yeah, the Marriage of Figaro did a deep dive into the opera, and that was a lot of fun. And that was book number 10. It was kind of a bunch of different things there, but that took me 14 hours and 16 minutes to get through that. Next up was Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, A Brief History of Humankind. Nothing really sticks out on this one, but it was an enjoyable one. Just, kind of a quick overview of human history. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't remember anything in that one. The Hitchhiker's Guide, it took me 11 hours and 24 minutes to read it. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was next up by Douglas Adams. And I'd heard a lot about this one, just was curious to read it. I never had. And thing I remember this is just how wacky it was. And yeah, that's about all I remember of that one. Next up, Nothing to See Here. Hitchhiker's Guide took me 3 hours and 44 minutes. Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. This was suggested by a couple people, and I had never read anything Kevin Wilson before. The thing I remember most about this is just the premise of the book. And the premise is that there's these kids that can just internally combust, like they'll set on fire. And yeah, it's out of the realm of possibility, but it's so close. I mean, you could just see like a kid getting so nervous that all of a sudden they just kind of burst into flames, and the flames don't hurt them, but just they burst into flames, and everyone freaks out. It's very close to the realm of possibility, and I love how Kevin Wilson just toyed with that line, and it just made me think of, you could do that in so many different ways with a novel where it just takes you right to the edge. Like, is this possible? It could maybe be possible, but I've never seen it. But what if that was possible? What would that entail? What would it be like? And that's kind of one thing I kept thinking about after reading this book. But I really enjoyed it. It was one I really enjoyed this year. And that took me 4 hours and 53 minutes to read. Next up was The Codebreaker by Walter Isaacson. I love reading Isaacson. And this one was the subtitle, Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing and the Future of the Human Race. So this one's about the CRISPR gene editing. And what I appreciated about Isaacson in this book is just that he went into all of the different ramifications and what should we be doing this with genes? Should we be editing our genes? There's a lot of ways that can help, but there are a lot of ways that could go wrong and ways it could be abused. You talk about designer children where the wealthy could potentially choose the different aspects of their child just by editing the genes. And so is that right? It brought forth a lot of the ethical and moral dilemmas from that while teaching you about what CRISPR is and all that. So it's a very good book. I mean, you're going to be reading a lot about that going forward. And so this is probably a good place to get introduced to that if you're not familiar with it. And that took me 10 hours and 8 minutes to read that one. Next up, book 15 was The 7-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. This is my first book by Merton. The bookstore where I'm business manager, the owner there, Joel Tomlin, he loves Merton. So I've seen Merton a lot at the bookstore and then just have heard a lot of people talk about him. I didn't know anything about him. So the main thing that sticks out to me about Merton is just that he was not a monk his whole life. Like he lived in New York. He was a rabble rouser for a while and then became a monk. And it was neat to read about that process. And I enjoyed that part of the book. Next, that took me 13 hours and 16 minutes. Next up was a very short book by Ken Follett called Notre Dame. And it was a short history of the meaning of cathedrals. And so this is after the Notre Dame in Paris burned. And so he wrote this short little book about it. And I don't really remember anything about it, but I do just love Notre Dame. And I've been in Paris a few times and I would just go in that building and sit in there. And it's probably my favorite building in the world. And I wish I remembered more of that book. But number 17, it took me 40 minutes to read. Number 17 is Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton. And this one took me 16 hours and 3 minutes to read. This is a book about, well, the subtitle is The Secret Agent Who Made the Pilgrimage to Mecca, Discovered this Kama Sutra, and Brought the Arabian Nights to the West. And it's by Edward Rice. This was just a very interesting book because I didn't know anything about Sir Richard Francis Burton, and I learned a lot about him. He was a spy for the British. He traveled the world. He was a first white man to do a lot of things, and just his experience. I mean, just all over. Like he was in the United States right before the Civil War. He was in South America. He was in Africa. He was in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, just all over the world, and just very neat to read and learn about this man. And then he discovered like the Arabian Nights and translated them and made them popular in the West, and same with the Kama Sutra as well. So those are the first 17 books on the 2022 reading list. All right, next up, the Unabomber Manifesto by Theodore John Kaczynski. The real title is Industrial Society and Its Future, but everyone knows it as the Unabomber Manifesto. And I was just curious more than anything, just wanted to read it, see what it said. And I'm glad I did. It's whereas the Engels book, I said that he called for revolution, but he really didn't. Well, in this one, Kaczynski actually does call for revolution, and he says, people are going to have to die for this message to get out, and that sort of thing. But so that's the main thing I remember. The other thing I remember, though, is just I think I was kind of expecting the ravings of a madman, and it's not that at all. It's quite coherent and kind of disturbingly so. But yeah, it's here's what's going on. This is where this will lead. Oh, and by the way, we need to get this message out. No one's going to read it unless we kill some people. And so, yeah, kind of disturbing, but interesting as well. Took me 2 hours and 56 minutes to read that. Book 19, Radical Hope by Jonathan Lear, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. This one's about the Crow Indians and the transition from being on their own to the white people coming in and life drastically changing. So what do you do when that happens? This one tied in very well with the first book on the list of On Reading Well by Karen Swallow Prior, because this one also talks about virtues. But what does virtue mean when the definition changes for a culture? So for the Crow, there was a certain thing they would do, and that was how they showed courage in their culture. But they couldn't do that anymore, and so they lost that. And so what does courage look like going forward? Can a people group change their definition of a virtue depending on the circumstances? What does that do to a society? What does it do to leadership? Can a leader guide a people through that? And what you see in this book is that, yes, a leader, in fact, did that very thing. How did he do it? That's kind of the question. The one thing that's kind of overall and the thing that stuck out. The other thing that stuck out was just the Crow. The way they would do things is when they came into a battle, they had this coop stick, and someone would go up and put that stick in the ground, and that defined the boundary. And so if the other group was going to come and attack, they had to get past that boundary. Like the boundary set the whole thing of the battle. And it was just a really interesting thing. And just, there's books about boundaries and setting boundaries in that. And here's a pretty vivid example of that in times of war. So that was quite interesting to read about. Next up, Book 20, Scotland 2070, Healthy, Wealthy, Wise, an Ambitious Vision for Scotland's Future Without the Politics. It was written by Ian and Dorothy Godden and then Hilary Sillito. I know the Goddens, and so I wanted to read this book by them, and it happened to coincide with a trip that I took to Scotland earlier this year as well. So I was reading this book actually while I was in Scotland and on the way over there and all that. And really neat book. They're presenting an idea on how Scotland can become healthy, wealthy, and wise in looking forward, specifically to the year 2070. So what would they need to change now for that to happen? And the thing that stuck out to me the most, and you're probably aware of this, but I didn't know about it, and it was that the water above Scotland, the water above Russia, that's melting, and the ships are starting to go through that, and they haven't been able to in the past because of ice, and now they're starting to get through that. And if that opens up into a major trade route, that's going to change a lot. That will change times from Scotland to China by sea. It will cut that drastically. And instead of having to go down and around, they can go kind of up and over. But that also puts Russia in a really good spot because they have a lot of land that is right against that waterway. And so when you're looking at Scotland, as this book is, Scotland could potentially look north for the first time for trade, for that sort of thing, as opposed to they've always had to look south to England and then beyond. They could potentially start looking north and trade routes and become a major player in that. But it also just brings up this point that Russia is going to control a big part of that as well. So what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of, and this book doesn't get into it, but it's just like, what does it mean in terms of with Ukraine right now and all that? Is that part of why Russia started that? Just kind of opens up a lot of questions, but just that knowledge that opens up a huge trade way above Russia, above Scotland, above Amsterdam, all that. Like, what does that do globally and with trade? Just a really interesting thing to think about. And then just cool to think about a country in that way. Like, how could a country change, a small country like Scotland change to become leaders in different areas? And what should they focus on and that sort of thing? So really enjoyed that one. It took me 6 hours and 5 minutes to read it. Next up was the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha is... well, it's in some people's Bibles. It's never been in a Bible that I've had, but you'll find it in a lot of, you'll find it in the Catholic Bible, and then like the Ethiopian Church, they have the parts of the Apocrypha, and so it's a part of the Bible that would fit between the Old and the New Testament, and so it's similar to the Bible in that sense, where there's wisdom literature, there's kind of like history. There's all sorts of stuff. There's fantasy stuff going on. There's even dragons in the Apocrypha, and I'd never read it, and I was actually always kind of afraid of it because it was never in the Bible I would read, and so why is it not in there? Is it bad stuff? Is it stuff I shouldn't be reading? So I'd never just picked it up and read it until this year, and I loved it. I was always kind of told that there was this 400-year period of silence between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, and that's not the case. There's quite a bit here just in the Apocrypha of what was happening during that time, and there are just these books of wisdom, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it, and so I'm going to try to make it a regular practice to read through the Apocrypha if I'm reading through the Bible. But yeah, I think that's kind of. I mean, there's just so much in the Apocrypha that it's hard to pick up one thing, but I guess if I'm taking a step back, the one thing would just be that I was so shocked that I liked it so much, and just kind of that, be careful what you read, but also don't be so fearful of things that you don't read it. So that was the Apocrypha. And it took me 17 hours and 32 minutes to read it. Next up was Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail in 1972 by Hunter S. Thompson. This was, so he's on the campaign trail, and it's just the good, the bad, and the ugly of politics. And this guy is kind of a mess himself, Hunter S. Thompson, and he's writing about everything that's going on, but he has a lot of insight, and he's just so honest with what's going on. I mean, he's kind of favoring a particular politician, and that alters how he sees things and his writing and predictions and all that. So neat book, my first book by Hunter Thompson. It was a decent read. Next up after that was The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carre. And this is a spy thriller and one of the classics. And it was very vivid. I remember the end very, very well, the writing, and also just kind of themes throughout. And the way he wrote, you just kind of felt like you were there. You felt the cold. You felt the intensity. But yeah, a very good one. Right after that was Rising Tiger by Brad Thor. And I read this one, the bookstore I mentioned earlier, Landmark Booksellers, where I'm business manager. We had Brad Thor come in, and he signed a bunch of books. And so I wanted to read it before he came in. So I just, if an author's coming in, I think it's fun to read a book and if I'm in the room with him, I get to talk to him and ask him questions about it as well. So I actually read this book in one day, just before I met him. I think I was like 40 pages left before I met him. So I didn't know the ending of the book when I was talking to him, but then went home and finished the book. So I did finish it in one day. It took me 6 hours and 14 minutes, but I kind of worked through it quickly. And I was glad to have read it right after the Jean Le Carre book, because the Rising Tiger is a new one, and the Spy That Came In From the Cold is a classic, and this one hits on a lot of things that are actually happening in the world right now, and it has the character go through, and yeah, but it was just things you've read about in the news and happening now, so that was neat. And it was just cool to be able to talk to the author about the book as well. And what's funny is that thing I mentioned in the Scotland 2070 book, where the Russia, the waterway opening up above Russia. So I mentioned that in when I was talking to Brad Thor while he was signing the book. So I was like, man, I just read this book, and he was talking about this waterway opening up. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly what my last book was about. The waterway opening up, black ice. Yeah. So that was kind of funny. Another foot in the mouth moment in my life. So that one took, I mentioned 6 hours and 14 minutes. Next up, book 25, A History of the World in Six Glasses. I love these kind of books. I love learning about drinks, and just, I used to travel internationally a lot, and it just always fascinated me to go to different parts of the world and see the differences in marketing. Like for instance, a beer that was kind of viewed as a crappy beer in the States would be the premier beer in another place. And then the one that was kind of a premier beer in the States would be just a regular one in another place. And a lot of that has to do with marketing and just how it's marketed in that country. And so I'm just kind of always been interested in it. But this one kind of goes through more of the history of the world, as the title would suggest, in the six glasses. So wine, tea, beer, coffee, and spirits. And then the last one is Coca-Cola. So neat book in that sense. One I would highly recommend. Tom Standage is who wrote that, and it took me 4 hours and 57 minutes to read it. Next up, Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut. This is the first novel I've read by Vonnegut. Took me 4 hours and 57 minutes to read it. I really loved Vonnegut's style, and that's the thing main thing I remember, and it made me want to read more Vonnegut just because of that style. So this was a very fun book to read about. It's like it takes place way in the future, but a guy writing about what happened in the past. I loved it. I hope to read more Vonnegut in the future. That might be one where I take a year and just read Vonnegut. Next up, Jack Hinson's One Man War. This one took me 9 hours and 28 minutes. And this is about a guy who lived near the Tennessee and Kentucky border. And the reason I read it is that at the bookstore, Landmark Booksellers, we have a Civil War section, because Franklin, Tennessee was a Civil War battlefield. A major battle took place right in the city center. And so we have a lot of people who come in for books about the Civil War, and this is one that our owner recommends a lot. And so it's one of those I wanted to read so that I could, if I'm talking to somebody about the book, I could tell them about it. And this is this is kind of like a John Wick story in a way, where this guy is just kind of minding his business right on the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, and he's got friends on the Union side, he's got friends on the Confederate side, and some Union soldiers kill his two sons one day, and then he just goes nuts and gets a rifle, and he's got this spot where he can set up right next to the river, but up on a hill, and then as boats go by, he'll just use that rifle and just start taking out officers. And so he does that. He kills well over 100 people, and just kind of takes things into his own hands for a while. But it's really interesting to read it and just to see what his family life was like during this time, his desire to not get involved in the war, but the war comes to him. It comes right to his doorstep, and just kind of makes you think, what would you do in that situation? You're just trying to mind your own business, and the war comes right on your land. What would you do? Very interesting book, and I'm glad I read it. Number 28, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This one took me 14 hours and 21 minutes. I had started this book a long time ago, probably 2006 or so, and then just only got 80 or 100 pages in and quit it. But I read it again this year, and I started again and finished it this year, and I just loved it. I mean, it was one of my favorites for the year, and it was just a very intense book, but like one that's very applicable to now. A lot of what is being talked about is earlier in the 1900s, or I mean mid 1900s, but it's a lot of stuff that we're still talking about and dealing with. A black man gets killed by a cop in this book, as one example, but just you see this man, and he's going through his life, and he's invisible to everybody. He's invisible to white people. He's invisible to black people. And what does that do to a man? But then also, what does that say about the culture? There's a lot going on here. A lot of just different situations this man is involved in that are just crushing, and very vivid book. One that is one of my favorites for the year. After that, I read The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And this one's timeless lessons on wealth, greed, and happiness. And he tied compound interest to investing, well, obviously, but he said he had one thing talking about Warren Buffett's net worth and how the majority of it has come after his 65th birthday. And that was astonishing. I mean, I've heard a lot about compound interest. I've read about it, and I know what it's supposed to do, but hearing that statement just really kind of put it into play. As the title of this book suggests, it's more of how to think about money holistically, as opposed to here are the do's and don'ts of money. So this is a good one on personal finance for you, but just more to kind of take that step back too, and think about money and approaching money as a whole. It took me 3 hours and 56 minutes to read that. After that, I read Present Concerns Essays by C.S. Lewis. And this is just a collection of different essays by Lewis. Lewis is one of my favorite authors, and so I try to have a book by C.S. Lewis every year. None of the essays really stick out in particular, but I always do enjoy reading Lewis. After that was The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And if you've listened to other episodes of this podcast, you know I have a history with Cormac McCarthy, in that I read Blood Meridian as part of my 2017 reading list and hated it, like just despised it, and didn't ever want to have anything to do with McCarthy again. And shared that in the podcast episode that I did about that book. That's one of those embarrassing episodes that I've kept up. And I got a lot of comments, just, you need to give this guy another try. And so I did. I gave Blood Meridian another try, and now it's one of my favorite books. So that was a big shift for me. And so this is my second McCarthy book for the project. And gosh, it was so good. The thing that sticks out to me about this book, a couple things. One is just the vivid portrayal, this father and son going through this wasteland, and so a lot of those scenes from the book stick with me. I can see them in my mind. The other thing is just I love how McCarthy writes, and you've got to be paying attention. And I find this may be a weird thing to say, but I find McCarthy helps me read the Bible better, because you have to pay attention. And if he's saying something here and it sounds weird, or it's like a weird turn of phrase, like you've got to pay attention to that, because he's trying to tell you something, and it might show up later, or it might be applicable to that scene. But I just love that. And I love that these books help me become a better reader. So The Road by Cormac McCarthy, it took me 4 hours and 33 minutes. Next up, The Truth and Beauty by Andrew Clavin. How the lives and works of England's greatest poets point the way to a deeper understanding of the words of Jesus. This is another one that the owner of Landmark Booksellers, he read this and just loved it. And so I wanted to see what all the hubbub was about. And so I picked this one up, and this was kind of a late addition to this year's reading list. But what I really appreciated is that he looks at some of the major poets of the 19th century, like Coleridge, Yeats, and a number of others. And I don't understand poetry very well. I would like to. I want to get more into it. And so this book is a great introduction in that sense. A lot of these poets were at like a particular dinner together, and he writes about that, and just, it's amazing to write about that, or to read about that. But then to hear how Coleridge influenced so many other poets, that was a really neat thing to read about. And that's kind of my main takeaway from this book, is just how much Coleridge influenced others. So next up in my reading project, I'm going through the great books. And so I actually ended up adding a lot of these poets to that list. That one took me 5 hours and 55 minutes to read. So I got 2 more to cover in this segment here. Next up is Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry. This is a novel, and this was the first Wendell Berry that I had ever read. Jayber Crow. What's neat is that this book takes place in an area that Port William, and a number of Wendell Berry's other books also take place in that same area. And so you'll come across names in Jayber Crow here that you'll recognize as titles for his other books. And so Wendell Berry's writing from different vantage points, but it's taking place in the same town. And so that's a cool idea. The thing that stuck out the most is just that I wanted to be Jayber Crow. And he was not a perfect man. He's not this, ridiculously idealistic person, but he's real. And I just loved how Wendell Berry wrote about him. And it was one of those books where you wanted to become the main character. And it took me 11 hours and 46 minutes to read it. And what was so cool, and this, I randomized the order of my books, and this one came up right next to Sir Gibbie by George MacDonald. So I read Jayber Crow, and then book 34 was Sir Gibbie by George MacDonald. And there were so many similarities between these two books. It was so neat to be able to read them back to back. But same thing, I wanted to be Sir Gibbie in the George MacDonald book. The way he wrote about this man, and he contrasted it with this priest who was another main character. And Sir Gibbie is this he can't speak, but he's doing all the things that the priest should be doing, and the priest is not doing any of these things. And he's saying, you actually can't do these things, and you shouldn't try to do these things. Yet here's Sir Gibbie doing these things in just a honest way. And again, he's not a perfect person, but you want to be him by the end of the book. And so it's cool. It's so cool to read these two books side by side. Jayber Crow and Sir Gibbie. Sir Gibbie took me 16 hours and 43 minutes to read. And George MacDonald is my wife's favorite author, so I try to read a book a year by him as well. So that'll do it for this segment, and then go through the final 18 books from 2022 in the next segment. Well, if you're still listening, thank you for sticking with me. This is so much fun to go through these books. I think a lot about the books that I want to read. And so if they've made it onto the reading list, I've thought about them a lot. And they're books I really want to read. And so it's just fun to talk about them and see what I recall from each one. So next up, book number 35, From the Holy Mountain by William Dalrymple. The subtitle on this one is A Journey Among the Christians of the Middle East. It took me 12 hours and 22 minutes to read it, and it is a book. Dalrymple travels among or through different parts of the Middle East and is looking for monasteries in particular, but he's looking for Christian communities. And what's neat is the monasteries that he comes across, a lot of them are in kind of their final days. And there's different reasons for this, and that's what you find out in the book. But these monasteries have been around for a while. So as Dalrymple is going to these monasteries, they're singing songs that they've probably been singing for 1,000 years or more. And they're doing things that that's probably how they've been doing it for most of history. And so it's just a neat look. And it's kind of in the last throes of it as he's going through it and traveling in these places. So it's neat to read about it and learn about it. And he's retracing the steps of a book and a monk many years prior. And so he's going through that journey, and this book is the result. But yeah, just a neat look at Christians in the Middle East and their current state of affairs. Book 36, Oranges by John McPhee. I read McPhee's book, draft number 4, 2 years ago for this project, and that's on the process of writing, but this is the first book I've read that McPhee has written other than that other one. And as the title would suggest, it's about oranges, and you've never known how little you know about oranges until you read this book. I learned a lot about oranges, and it just made me want to drink orange juice and eat oranges, and I did that after reading this book. But yeah, if you want a thorough overview of oranges, this is a great book to read. And then if you just want to read like an author that is very good at his craft, McPhee is that person. So that one took me 2 hours and 40 minutes. Next up, Reading While Black by Esau McCaulley, African-American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. And in this one, Esau McCaulley talks about how it's very beneficial to look at interpreting the Bible through different cultural vantage points and how that can lead to deeper insight, and especially with the African-American experience in the United States. What can that community teach other communities about that process of interpreting the Bible? Very neat book, and one that I'm glad that I read. That one took me 4 hours and 23 minutes to read. Next up is The Mind of the Maker by Dorothy Sayers. This was book 38. It took me 5 hours and 6 minutes to read it. This is a book about the creative process, and it's Dorothy Sayers was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and she knew them, and then she's written a number of detective stories and that sort of thing. So yeah, just I've read a lot of these types of books. This one's kind of considered a classic in that area of creativity and art, and how does that connect to faith, that sort of thing. Next up, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This one took me 1 hour and 47 minutes, and it goes through his life. Yeah, I don't remember much other than that from that one. Next up, number 40, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is a novel, and this one was I was so engaged in this one. I didn't know what was going to happen, and a very vivid book, one I really enjoyed reading. Book 41 was Wild Problems by Russ Roberts, a guide to the decisions that define us. This one took me 2 hours and 54 minutes to read. And Russ talks about, Russ is an economist. He has a podcast called Econ Talk, and I've listened to that since 2013. I love the podcast, and I've read all of Russ's other books. What's interesting about this one is, as an economist, he approaches problems from a certain vantage point, or he's taught to, but he sees that there's a lot of problems in life that we can't approach in a certain way. You can't take a pro-con list to certain problems in life. And so how do you approach those types of problems? And that's what this book is about. He calls them wild problems. What tool set do you come to with those types of problems? And it's not the pro-con list. So Very helpful book. That one's a great one to buy for graduates. After that was The Body by Bill Bryson. And this one took me 10 hours and 27 minutes to read. The thing that stuck out most about this book is just how often he said, talked about the things that we don't know about the human body. So I learned a lot about the body, but it's also astonishing just how much we still don't know. And I'm glad he was honest about that in the book. After that, I read Why Art Matters, A Call for Christians to Create by Alistair Gordon. Just kind of so I'm a website developer, and I was doing a website for an awesome hotel in Edinburgh, Scotland, and they sell artwork that is done by Alistair Gordon. And so I got on a call with Alistair one day about just, getting his artwork on the website and stuff like that, and saw that he had a book. So I added it to my reading list, but really neat book. Just another one kind of on the idea of creativity in the Bible, and what does it mean for us as image bearers of God to create? What does that entail? That sort of thing. The one thing that stuck out in this book is that he kept calling people makers. He said God is the creator, and then people are makers. And a lot of the other books I've read about this call people the creators, and that we're co-creators. And so that the terminology kind of messed me up a little bit in this one, because I've always liked to think of it as co-creators as opposed to makers. I know it's really kind of a strange thing to say, or maybe a little technical, but that's one thing that comes to mind when I think of this book. After that, I read the Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson, and this is a 4-book series, and so I'll talk about the series as a whole, but these were books 44 through 47, and then there was another book after that I'll get into next. But this is I've read Andrew Peterson's nonfiction work, and I've been listening to his music recently, and we've had this series at the store, but I didn't think I was the intended audience, because the imagery on it, it just looks like it's geared towards a younger audience. And so I'd hesitated getting into it, but I'd heard so many good things, and I'd specifically seen people say that they were reading it to their kids, and that they would just need to take a break and cry. And it was just such an emotional book. It was reaching so deep into these people that it's like they just had to take a break and kind of, regroup. And so I read it, and I was just amazed. I'm glad I read it. I think going in, I just had that mentality that it was going to be a children's book. And to me, a children's book is one where the end, what's going to happen is predictable, and that was not the case in this book at all. It was just over and over. I was struck, and I was surprised, and all that. And so, very good series. I'm glad I read it, and then it ties into the next book. So there's the Wingfeather Saga, and then there's a 5th book called the Wingfeather Tales. And this is a collection of 7 different tales, and 2 of them are written by Andrew Peterson, who wrote the Wingfeather Saga, but then 5 of them are written by other authors. And so what they're doing is taking little snippets of things that you learn about in Wingfeather, and they're kind of expanding on these things. And so it was great. I've actually wanted to read a lot of the authors who wrote these tales, and so that was cool. But the last story, and it encompasses half the book, was written by Doug McKelvey, and it's called The Places Beyond the Maps. And that story just blew me away. I covered it in a podcast episode. I wasn't planning to, but it was one of the best things I've read. And the way it tied into the Wingfeather Saga, and I was crying at the end of the book, and that just does not happen for me when I'm reading. And so it was an experience in that sense, but just the way it was written, the content, it blew me away. And so the Wingfeather Saga, and then plus these Wingfeather Tales. That was amazing. The Wingfeather books, the book 1 took me 7 hours and 9 minutes to read. Book 2, 9 hours and 53 minutes. Book 3, 7 hours and 41 minutes. Book 4, 11 hours and 34 minutes. And then the Wingfeather Tales took me 9 hours and 27 minutes. After that, I read The Viking Heart, How Scandinavians Conquered the World. This one's by Arthur Herman, and he wrote how the Scots invented the modern world. And I'd read that one a while ago and loved that one. My family heritage is Norwegian, and so I like to try to read at least one book a year about Norwegians or history and that sort of thing. And this one was the perfect book for that. It talked about the history, but then it talked about some more of the recent history, especially with migrations from that part of the world to America. And in my forebears would have been a part of that. So it was just neat to read about that. And then again, kind of like the Longships book I read earlier in the year, I just learned so much about the history of Scandinavia. After that, I read The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Rostad, and this one is about Churchill. So the subtitle here is A Saga of Churchill Family and Defiance During the Blitz. The thing that stuck out most is just how life went on during these nightly bombings, and then also just how the courage of Churchill, how that changed the whole thing. Like the Nazis were not prepared for that. They did not think there would be that level of defiance by Churchill. And just from the start, he's like, we're not backing down. We're going to fight this to the last man. And that just shifted so much of the war. So this book takes place during about a 1 year period between 1940 and 1941. But the way Larson writes, it almost reads like fiction. And that one took 13 hours and 50 minutes. The Viking Heart one took 13 hours and 17 minutes. Now to book 51, just got 2 left here. Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. This is the memoir of Phil Knight, and it's about the founding of Nike. And it gets in. The thing that stuck out the most is just how close they were to failure so much as a company, and how they just barely made it through. And very neat. Very neat to read about that. And then just how the company was founded by runners, and how that was a big part of the early part of the company. Last book, that took me 8 hours and 30 minutes. Last book for the year was The Dawn by Yoram Hazony. And this was a book that was suggested by Russ Roberts, the host of Econ Talk. And this was amazing. It's political teachings of the Book of Esther. And it's a pretty deep dive into the Book of Esther that's in the Hebrew Bible. And gosh, I learned so much, but then just the way that he would dig into each word, I heard somebody say that the Bible is a magic book, and it reading this book, The Dawn, it kind of, I guess, gave more insight into that, in the sense that there's so much going on in the words and what the words of the text are saying, but how they're referencing other things as well, that you can read a chapter and just spend endless hours on digging deep. And there's just like a magic to that of the words are there, but there's so much going on, and there's so much that you can talk about, and he goes into those things in the story, but then just ties it to like what is power like, and what is what does that what do we learn about power in this story? What who has the power? And it was really neat. I'll be covering this one on an upcoming episode of the podcast, but I loved this book, and I'm really glad I read it. And that was the book that closed out the year. So that's the 52 books. In the next segment, I'm gonna cover some things of like top 5 overarching ideas and that sort of thing. All right, here's the final segment here. First, I'm going to start off with the top 5. So here are my top 5 books from that list of 52. And I'll go from 5, 4, 3, 2, and then 1 being my absolute favorite. So in the number 5 position, I'm gonna cheat and do a tie here, and the tie is going to be with Sir Gibby and Jaber Crow. And you heard me mention that the books are similar in a lot of ways. They were both so good. I wanted to be the main character in each, and so that they tied for number 5. Number 4 was The Dawn by Yoram Hazony. That's the last one I covered, and that was the final book on the list for this year. The insight into the Book of Esther was very good, and then there were just some sections that just nailed me in the sense of things I struggle with or things I've been thinking about, I just found that to be very helpful. So I'll probably get into that more in the episode coming up where I talk about that book, but that ended up being number 4. Number 3 was The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I just thought it was an incredible novel, and I was very moved by it. The number 2 was I'm gonna bunch a bunch of books here together, and I'm gonna say the Wingfeather Saga plus the Wingfeather Tales. The Wingfeather Saga itself, just I was amazed. I was very surprised. I loved it, and then the Tales that especially the story by Doug McKelvey just wrecked me. So if a book can make me cry, it's special, and the novella that Doug McKelvey wrote, it made me cry. And number 1 for my 2022 reading list is The Apocrypha. And again, I think it was just a lot that it surprised me. I had been scared of it my whole life, and then I read it and I loved it. I can't wait to read it again. And so that's number 1. Now I want to just highlight the books that I didn't read. So I've talked about the way I put together my reading list before, where I pick the 52 books, I randomize the order, and then I just go reading them in order. I made a lot of changes this year, and part of that was just because I'm starting a second phase of this project next year of starting to read through the great books. So this was really my last chance before I started reading those great books to read books that were not part of the Great Books series, and specifically newer books. And so that kind of once I decided to do that, it kind of honed my list of like, okay, there are some books I really, really want to get through before I start doing this Great Books thing. And so I removed some. I actually had 5 of the great books on my list for this year. They were going to be the last 5 books. And I removed them because I'm just going to start next year on that. And then that opened up some spots. And I wanted to read the Wingfeather Saga. So that was those 5 books there. But here's some other ones that were on the original list that I ended up not reading. And for some of these, I'll give a reason why. The first one is the SHIT They Never Taught You by Adam Jones and Adam Ashton. This was a book that was sent to me, and Adam Jones and Adam Ashton have a reading project kind of similar to mine, and they do a podcast on the books. And so what they did is cover ideas and things they noticed in different books. And I wanted to read it. I think I replaced that one with the David story, and that was because I got involved with this reading group, and so I needed to read that book at that specific time, and so it replaced that book. Next up was He Saw That It Was Good by Sho Baraka, another book that I wanted to read, but another book on that creativity and art side of things, where I had some other books on the list this year, so I ended up removing that one. Next up was Noise by Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman's book Thinking Fast and Slow is one of my favorites for this entire reading project, and so I wanted to read his other book. Just kind of figured whatever Kahneman puts out is going to be pretty good, but other things came up, and so that was one that I ended up removing. On Writing by Stephen King, another book that I've been wanting to read a while, but it got knocked off. A Man at Arms by Stephen Pressfield. Kind of felt guilty because this book was sent to me, and so I wanted to read it. I like the premise of the book, but I decided to to replace that with another book. After that, Beloved by Toni Morrison. This is a book I started, and the content, it was just too much for me. And I tried a couple times. I went to a certain point in the book. It's like, I just can't do this anymore. Let me move to the next book and then try to come back to it. Read the next book, finished it, tried to come back to Beloved, and again, just couldn't do it. Just too much. Maybe in the future I'll come back to it, but it was too much for me at this point. Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. I picked up the book for the sole purpose of reading a quote that really bothered me. People would quote this one part of the book, and they would quote it as though Haruki Murakami said it, but he didn't say it. A character in his book said it. And so I got up to that part of the book and read that quote, read the context for that quote, and then talked about it in a podcast episode. But just some of the content in the book, I didn't want to read further. And so I shelved that book as well and picked up another. Next was Technological Society by Jacques Ellul, and another one that I had designs to read and just ended up not reading it. The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. His coddling of the American mind was very impactful when I read that a few years ago for this project, but one that I replaced from another book. Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings by Neil Price. I replaced that one with The Viking Heart. I just thought that The Viking Heart was more of what I was looking for, and I think I was correct in that. And so that was another one that I didn't read. Here are the books that I replaced those with. The David Story, Rising Tiger by Brad Thor, One Man's War, Jack Hinson, The Truth and Beauty by Andrew Clavon, Wild Problems by Russ Roberts, The Wingfeather Saga and Tales, The Viking Heart, and The Dawn. So those are the ones that replaced the ones that I didn't read. Now, just a few overarching ideas or insights from this year, and it may not even be necessarily related to the books that I read, but it's just things that I've been thinking about, and then I think about them often now, and so I'll actually kind of see these in some of the books that I read this year. But the first one, and I highlighted this earlier, is just when I read that Engels book, and it I read the book I read things into the book that were not there. And so that was just a huge lesson for me, and one that I will have in the forefront of my mind, especially as I start going through the great books. I will have heard a lot of things about the books that I'm going to be reading for the great books, but I need to go in as much as possible just with an open mind, in the sense of, what is the text actually saying? Not what do I want it to say, what do I think it says, but what does it actually say? And I want to become that type of reader. So that was a good insight and thing that I learned this year. It was a hard lesson, but a good one. Another insight from this year is just illustrations. And this will sound very weird but there are illustrations in books. And yeah, obviously, right? But I don't think I ever made the connection of the importance of the illustrations. And so where this came into play this year is that I met some illustrators. And one illustrator I met was Ned Bustard. And what's funny is he did the illustrations for the very first book I read this year, On Reading Well by Karen Swallow Prior. So the cover of that book is done by Ned Bustard. The prints throughout the book, Ned Bustard. And I got to meet Ned Bustard this year and see a number of his other projects and books and all that. And so just this connection between the illustrations and books, it's just something I never had given thought to before. I mean, I would see the illustrations, but it never struck me to consider them or look at them. Like I've always been more concerned with the words, but there's a lot of thought that goes into these illustrations, and just meeting illustrators this year and kind of making that connection that may sound like the most obvious thing in the world to you, but it's really impacted me. I bought the Barry Moser Bible, and he's got a ton of illustrations in there, and just flipping through that and seeing how he thought of of the particular story, and to see these people's faces and that sort of thing. It's fascinating. So I'm into illustrations now. I'm actually, when I'm opening up books and I'm looking to see who the illustrator is, I'm looking to see how they portrayed the scene from the book. And that's something I never did before. So it's something that has started this year as a result of people I met and this reading project. Another thing I've been thinking about a lot lately as well is short and long compositions, and particularly with writing, but also with music. So where I've been thinking about this is especially with Andrew Peterson. So he wrote this huge Wingfeather saga, and 4-book series, and then he wrote some of the tales and all that. It's just this huge thing. But then he writes 3-minute songs as well. And what's the difference in those things? Or maybe poetry versus a novel. Some poets also write these large novels. And so something I've been thinking about a lot lately is just, what's the difference in those things? How does the author or the writer, how do they approach each of those things? If you're compacting big ideas into a 3-minute song, that's going to look a lot different than how a novel unfolds. And so, yeah, it's just got me curious on those things. Another idea that just pops up all the time, and I see it throughout this project, and it came up in a number of books again this year, is just unseen work, and kind of this idea of daily decisions and decisions we make on mostly when we're alone. Maybe 99% of these things being decisions we make when no one's looking, when no one can see our inner thoughts. What direction are we moving with those decisions? And this unseen work, like successful people, they put in a ton of this unseen work, and then all of a sudden they're at this certain level in their life, but they've done so many hours of this unseen work. And it's just, again, I see it all the time in the books I read, and just saw it again in a lot this year as well. Galapagos, just what I shared earlier, Galapagos, but then also the book by Kevin Wilson. I just love how authors will take a unique approach. So it's very close to how things are, but you just shift it slightly, and it creates this whole different world, this whole different way of thinking about things. And I just love that idea. And so it's something I've been thinking about a lot as well this year. So those are some of the kind of overarching ideas and things I've been pondering. A couple more things here, just a recap of the project. I started Books of Titans in 2017. I wanted to read more books, and I wanted to remember what I read. And so for the past 6 years, I've been doing I've made a list of 52 books each year. In some of the years, I made it through all 52. Some of the years I didn't. I made it through all 52 this year. But that's been the past 6 years, from 2017 to 2022. Now I am shifting. So that I'm calling that previous iteration phase 1. I'm now moving to phase 2, and I'm going to read through the great books. And it's something that it just makes sense. I've been collecting the great books for most of my life. I've got a lot of them, and I've wanted to read them. But what I've learned from this reading project is that if I don't have a plan to read them, they'll just sit on my shelf and I'll never get to them. So the great books is kind of the best way I know to make sure I read all of these. And it's going to take a long time. I expect it to take 10 years. And I've made a list of 200 of the great books, or the great authors, or the great series. And so there's 200 of them. I'll probably do 20 per year, because with each great book, I'm going to read a guide book. So that might be a book about the cultural context of the book, just maybe a book that helps understand it but greater, and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's the plan. But I'm also going to have breaks in those 10 years. So the first 2 months of each year, I just want to read straight through the Bible. I did that in 2020 for this reading project. That was the first book I started out with, and it made a big impact. And then it's just something I want to do And so each year I'm going to start off the first 2 months of the year reading through the Bible from start to finish. Then I'll take March, April, May, and June and read the great books. I'm going to just read them in order from the oldest to the newest. I'll take July off each year, and that'll be for extracurricular reading. So books that are just not part of the great books. And that just kind of, I'll be able to take a break. And then, so that's July. Then August, September, October, November, I'll be back to the great books. And then each December, I will also use just for fun reading or books that come up during the year that I want to read. So that's the schedule going forward. I would love for you to join. I have some people who have said that they'd like to do that, whether it's just a few of the books or all of them. I think it's going to be really fun. And I want to try to have some things where we can discuss the books in person or online. So please let me know if you have any interest in that. And then for what's coming up immediately for the project, I've got this episode and then another upcoming episode. I've read 291 books now for the first 6 years of this project, and I want to take 15 kind of overarching ideas. And these are ideas that I call important ideas because I've seen them in a number of different books, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, biographies. They just come up a lot, and so I consider them to be important ideas. And so I want to have an episode where I just go through some of these ideas and talk about where I heard them and that sort of thing. And then I will cover the dawn in an upcoming episode as well. And then, just starting off January 1st, 2023 with the Bible. I'm going to read the Bibliotheca version. It's split into 5 books. So I will read the Apocrypha this time. I'll read the Apocrypha every other year when I read through the Bible. But my plan is just to read a different version of the Bible each year to start off the year. And so Bibliotheca this year, next year I will probably do the Barry Moser Bible, and that's King James version. So I want to do a different translation and then just a unique version of the Bible each year. So looking forward to that, and just can't wait to get started with the great books as well. That's going to do it for this episode. If you're still listening, thank you for sticking through. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com with any questions or comments. If you want to share something you got out of one of the books I talked about in this episode, I'd love to hear that. It's one of the reasons I started this project, is just to be able to connect to other readers, and especially readers who are reading the books that I'm reading. I'd love for you to go to the website of Landmark Booksellers. If you want to support this project, that's the best way you can do it, is to start buying some of your books from Landmark. We ship all across the United States. We ship internationally as well. If you put in a coupon code Books of Titans, that'll get you 10% off any of the books. And we carry a lot of the books that I've read for this project. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and go to the website. I've got a ton of resources there. I'm also revamping the site just a bit for going into 2023. So you can take a look at my list of the great books that I'll be reading, and just my other reading lists and that sort of thing. I'll be back in a week or two with some of these other episodes coming up. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.